Hey, so back to the build bench, and today we're going to do an assembly video on the GCM LRT2 combo kit. You guys have seen this on the site, and thank you, by the way, for all the pre-orders and for your support. We've been running this project for quite a long time, and it's taken a long time for us to get the stock in and actually get everything put together, packaged, and ready to go. And the combo works great. We've been running it on the CMAX prototype trucks, 3 of them, for about a year now, and we really are very satisfied with it. So now it's time to send it to you, and here's an assembly video on putting together all of the LRT2 stuff, so stay tuned. So the first thing we're going to do today is assemble the motor on the motor plate. It's a pretty straightforward setup. This is what the thing looks like. It's basically all you're going to do is get your motor attached to the motor plate here and make sure that the screws are loose. You don't want to tighten the screws all the way. And then you can simply take one of the bearings. There's a set of bearings you'll see at the motor plate. There's a wheel, there's a bearing, there's a 5x11x4 standard sort of wheel bearing. That bearing is going to go underneath the motor into the motor plate right here. So just push the bearing in, and your motor is loose on there, so that's ready to go. And the next thing we want you to do is to take the step gear here. This gear actually acts as the spur gear. This gear also does the initial drive inside the scale transmission, so we're going to take this and actually put it into the bearing on the motor plate, and that is going to tell you how far away the motor and the initial drive gear are. You can see the distance there. And then when you take the pinion gear and slide the pinion gear onto the motor, you can set up that gear mesh. So that's the important thing that we're going to do right now. This is really easy. Basically all I want you to do is drop in that initial step gear, put the set screw side of the gear towards the motor. You'll see that this gear is very long, and the set screw will be well out of the way of the gearing portion. So we'll loosen that off and align the 2 gears together so that the end of the pinion gear matches the edge of the first gear, and they're nicely in line. You can see that there. And then tighten down your set screw on the motor with some Loctite of your favorite desire. And then what you want to do is, using the 2 screws on the motor slide here, on the motor plate, you want to adjust the motor so that there is a very small amount of back and forth rocking freedom on the gear. Okay? That's what you're trying to achieve. So you want to bring the motor down far enough so that there's a little bit of rocking motion on the gear, and that will allow you to get a nice gear mesh without binding. And I'll give you a chance to test that out in a bit when we get to the transmission assembly, but you want to do this first. So you should end up, at this point, you should end up with a setup that looks like this. I'm using the CMAX plate, but the universal mounting plate has exactly the same assembly. So either one of those, this goes on the same way, and you should have a setup like this with the initial drive gear. And then what I want you to do is take this setup and marry it onto the scale tranny. They simply go together like this. That should all fit together quite nicely and easily, and at this point you can put in the hardware that goes on the outside of the tranny, which is also included in your kit. For this exercise and the sake of time, I'm just going to put in a couple of these screws so that I can keep it from falling apart, and then we'll move on. So this is a good time to put in all your scale hardware, especially if you've got your grease in and everything already, then you're all set. And there we go. Now you'll notice that on the tranny there's absolutely no tail shaft. The tail shaft is going to go in right now, and that's what we're going to use to test your gear mesh. So The way to do that assembly is really quite easy. I want you to take off the tail shaft of the transmission. There's 4 screws here, and we're going to take these all off. The screws are metric number 2 size thread. If you happen to lose one or need to replace one, they're metric 2. Very easy to find everywhere, hobby shops, online. And these are stainless steel variety. So we're going to take off this tailstock, and you'll see that the tailstock has a bearing in the top. It does not have any bearings in the bottom, but they are included in that little plastic bag with the gears. Okay, there's a little tiny bag with gears, and it comes with 2 different sizes of bearings, and we're going to put those on the tail shaft in a minute. And so get a hold of the tail shaft now. That's the next thing you need to find, which is this very long steel black shaft here that we've made up. And I want you to take the biggest gear that you find in your gear set that has the finest teeth on it. It's a great big gear with many teeth. This is a 30-tooth 48 pitch for those of you who are interested. And get a drive pin. All the pins are the same, so don't worry about which one. Get a drive pin, put that on the shaft first, and then you're going to take the gear and slide it over the short end of the shaft, over the pin, making sure that it's completely covering the pin. And if you want to test out whether you have it on or not, you can take a bearing just for fun and put it over the end of the gear, and the bearing should be flat with the end of the shaft. So that's a great way to test out whether it's fitting or not. Make sure it's down all the way on the pin. And this setup right here, you can now grease up and stick it into the back of the transmission, right here. Okay? So grab a bearing, put the bearing in there, and then you can take the transmission output shaft with the big 48 pitch gear on it and actually install it right in there. And now at the end of your tranny you should have the gear and the very long shaft. And now what I'm going to get you to do is those 2 little bearings that were in that special package with the gears, you're going to put the big bearing on first on the tall shaft, and then the small bearing on the tall shaft. So you have a bit of a bearing stack on there. And then take the tailstock and put the tailstock back on the transmission. Add your grease, of course. And that should all fit on there, just like that. Okay? So now that you've got all this stuff all set up and greased, I want you to reinstall the 4 screws that go around the tail shaft. Okay? There's 4 little screws that you've just removed. I want you to put them back in so that the transmission is again closed up. I will say that for you guys who are looking for a completely waterproof setup, I would recommend that you split the gears, or split the transmission parts, the sections, split them only about halfway open, and put a little bit of waterproof grease on the seams where the case halves actually match together. Put a little bit of waterproof grease on there, just to make sure that you don't end up with some fluid soaking in if you have it dunked for a long period of time. Now, you'll find this is probably too stiff, and you'll also find that the shaft is floating quite a bit in and out in the back of the tranny's tailstock. Don't worry about any of that. What I do want you to do though is test out your gear mesh now, and the way you do that is by sticking an Allen key or a wrench into the end of the tail shaft and turn it by hand. Okay? And you should be able to turn this really easily with a wrench in it. If you find that it's binding or it's got notchiness to it, then your motor is too tight on the initial drive gear. Okay, so loosen off your motor slightly, back it off the gear slightly. You may have to fine tune that, but what I want you to do is come up with a solution where it turns very easily from the tail shaft. It should turn very easily and freely with no notching and no binding, and it just seems nice and free. You should be able to just turn this all day with one finger around and around. Can you hear it? It just feels nice and free and easy. That's what you need, okay? No notching, no binding, and if you have any of that, you need to readjust your motor pinion on the initial drive gear. Now we're going to move to putting the LRT2 case on the back of the transmission. It's a very simple setup, and I want you guys to have a look for the hardware to mount this on. The first thing you're going to have to decide is whether you want a left drop case or a right drop case. What I mean by that is, you can see here that this case and this case here, I'll see if I can hold these all up at the same time. So there's two different setups here. Okay, this one I'm calling a left drop. The transmission output for the front drive shaft comes out of the left side of the vehicle, and this one here comes out of the right side of the vehicle. Now you can use the same case parts for doing a left drop or right drop. Depending on how you assemble them, the case will actually be reversible, okay? So think that through. And obviously I already have one here that's right drop, so I'm going to build one that's left drop for right now. And the first thing you're going to do is take the case that would match the left drop output and slide it over top of your tailstock, okay, like this. You slide that over there, and then you need the metric 2.0 hardware that screws into that. The little stainless steel screws that go in there, and you're going to screw those down only enough to hold the case on so it doesn't fall off, okay? Do not tighten these screws yet, and this is very important. Do not tighten these screws, okay? I'm going to keep, whoops, wrong screw, sorry. Do not tighten these little screws, because you have to align the case with the shaft before you can tighten the screws, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Let me get these 4 screws in here. Now keep in mind that the threads that go into the tranny are very small. All of this hardware is very small. There is no need whatsoever for cranking down the screws or anything like that. Okay, you can be gentle on the parts. They don't need a lot of torque. If you are inclined to put thread locker on these screws, feel free, but I would recommend that you use some very, very light thread locker, if any. So, here we go. I'm building a left drop setup. So I'm putting this particular case half on the tranny first, and then to locate it, I'm going to take this bearing and I'm going to slide the bearing over top of this shaft, the output shaft, and that bearing is going to slide right into the end of the transfer case like this. And now the case is actually located on the shaft using the bearing. Got it? And now I can tighten the screws. So I'm going to, there's no need to fiddle with it anymore. You can just tighten those down, and your bearing will locate the shaft so that it's all in line now, and this shaft should still slide in and out, in and out of the tranny. You can still slide it. Now we're going to fix that sliding using the drive pin. Now you're going to take another little black drive pin, and I want you to put it into the shaft right on top of that new bearing you just installed. And then on top of that new pin, you're going to install the biggest gear that you have left with the biggest knobby teeth that you've got left, and it just drops right over top of that pin like that. Drop that big gear over the pin. Okay, got it? And then I'm going to get you to take a bearing and put the bearing on top of that gear. So there's the setup you have now. Now take another bearing, add the bearing to the center of the LRT2, right there. And I want you to add the gear that has the two little stumps sticking out of it. It's a gear with the shaft already on it, you know what I mean? So put that on next. If you feel like greasing those ahead of time, go ahead, but I like to put my grease in after when the case is together, almost together. And then you can take the last bearing for the front part of the case and drop it into the LRT2, just like that. Drop in that bearing. And then we're going to build the front output shaft. So you're going to take a drive pin, put the drive pin in the small hole right there, and then you're going to take the lower gear, put the lower gear over the shaft and cover the pin with the lower gear to produce the driving setup on the lower shaft, just like that. And then I want you to put the shaft into the output of the transfer case, pointing forward. So that will just slide right in there. And then you have a 3-gear transfer case that's now assembled. And then you're going to put on the other 2 bearings. There's 2 bearings left that go on the outside case of the LRT2. Drop those on. This would be a good time to add all of your grease into your transfer case. And then the last thing to assemble is actually the case half. And the case half will just slide over all of those components, just like that. And then the attachment screw for your case half is, I just dropped it. That was great. Welcome to live video.
Get a real job.
Dana's laughing at me. So the attachment screw for your case halves, which are already tied together by the way that they're designed. That's this little silver screw here. And depending on which side of the case you're using, if it's left or right drop, the screw will either go in the back or the front. Okay. In my case, it goes in the front, so I'm just going to drop that in there and get it wiggled into position. And I'm going to screw that on, and don't crank this down. Like I said, this is very small screws here. They're all very small screws. Don't crank it down, just put it in. Make it contact, maybe a quarter turn, that's it. Don't tighten it, over tighten it. And then now is a good time for you to put your wrench back in the output shaft, and then just make sure that it's all turning nice. It should actually be no different than before. You should still have no tension in the front. It should still turn nice and free, and you can listen to that. Sounds like angels singing. No binding or grinding or any of that stuff. So that just makes sure that all your gears are all aligned properly and your pins are seated properly. And you'll notice at this point the tail shaft on the tranny no longer floats in the transmission or the transfer case. Because it was made to do that. So yeah. And the front output shaft doesn't float either. There's a little tiny bit of play in there, but there's nothing to be concerned about, and there's no more float in the back shaft. So you did a good job. Right on. Now you'll see that the back of the transfer case, there's 4 holes. These are for the bottom 2, I would suggest, or the top, are for mounting onto your mounting bracket, however you decide to do that. And the other ones are for set screws that will actually just plug the holes. So you'll find in your kit that there's 4 little tiny set screws, and they actually just go into these 4 back holes that aren't being used. And you can use the 4 set screws with Loctite, and they just seal the case. That's all they do is seal the case. Otherwise, you'll see that there's these 2 2.5 millimeter screws here. And what you can do with these is actually screw them into those holes instead of using the set screws. And they will plug the holes to make it watertight, but they will also allow you to put a mounting bracket on there. So with the 2 screws right here at the top, or using the ones at the bottom, it'll still clear your drive shaft, and you can use those for putting a mounting bracket on just the same way that you're going to do in the front on the sides of the motor plate, and away you go. So that's the assembly for the LRT2 motor plate and transfer case and tranny combo. And we're very excited to see where you're going to stick these. The first place I'm going to put this is in my Patera Ascender because it's just begging for me to cut the hood off and make it opening hood. And of course you've already seen this, but this is the setup that we're using in the GCM CMAX chassis. It's an exact replica of that. And the CMAX motor plate only has a single hole, whereas the universal motor plate has 2 mounting holes, and otherwise that's the only change in the kit. And so we're very excited for this to be out and for all of us to finally have an overdrive front output for all of our standard ratio drive axles, and that's very exciting too. So here's to better steering and lots of good hill climbing and awesome tiny trucking.